Some stories are written by hand, others by dream. But the rarest kind, those are written by absence, by silence. They come not from ink alone, but from the places where memory once lived. Tonight, I offer you the tale of a poet, a man forgotten by history, but not by the Chronicle. His name was Lawrence Marrow. He did not seek prophecy, only meaning. But what he found instead was me. The fog rolled through Spitalfields like a living thing that November morning, threading between the narrow alleys and settling into the crevices of crumbling brick buildings. Lawrence Marrow pulled his threadbare coat tighter as he wandered the maze of market stalls, their vendors calling out prices for everything from mouldering books to questionable cuts of meat. He had been walking for hours, his latest rejection letter crumpled in his pocket. "Too experimental," the editor had written. Not what readers want. Lawrence's small inheritance was nearly spent, and his landlord had begun leaving increasingly pointed notes beneath his door. The bookstall appeared through the mist, like something summoned rather than discovered. It was tucked between a fishmonger's stall and a woman selling herbs from mason jars, yet somehow Lawrence felt certain it hadn't been there moments before. The vendor sat hunched behind towers of leather-bound volumes, his milky eyes staring at nothing, fingers trailing across book spines with the delicacy of a pianist. "Looking for something specific, are we?" The man's voice carried an odd accent, perhaps Welsh or something older. Lawrence approached slowly. The books were beautiful, but strange. Volumes with titles in languages he couldn't identify, others with covers that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. "I'm a poet," he said, finally. "I need inspiration." The blind vendor's fingers paused on a particular volume. It was smaller than the others, bound in deep burgundy leather that looked almost black in the weak light. The cover bore no title, only intricate tooling that formed patterns Lawrence couldn't quite follow with his eyes. "This belonged to a dreamer who never woke," the vendor said, lifting the journal with reverent care. "A man who wrote his life in margins and forgot to live it in the world." Lawrence opened the journal. Every page was pristine, unmarked. The paper had a strange quality. It seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "How much?" £3. The price was steep for his circumstances, but something about the journal called to him. The leather was warm beneath his fingers, as though it had been sitting in sunlight rather than London fog. As he counted out the coins, the vendor tilted his head. "A word of advice, poet. Some gifts come with invisible strings. Mind you don't get tangled." But when Lawrence looked up from his purse, the stall was gone. Only the fishmonger and the herb woman remained, neither seeming to notice that anything had changed. In his hands, the journal felt heavier than before. That evening, Lawrence sat in his cramped attic room, the journal open on his desk beside a flickering candle. He had tried to write in it, but his pen seemed reluctant to mark the strange paper. Every word appeared faded, as though the ink was being slowly absorbed. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him. He fell asleep at his desk, his head pillowed on his arms, the journal still open beneath him. In his dreams, he stood in a vast library where the shelves stretched impossibly high. The air tasted of old paper and midnight rain. A figure moved between the stacks, always just beyond clear sight, leaving only the whisper of footsteps and a faint scent of ink. When Lawrence tried to call out, his voice made no sound. He woke to morning light streaming through his grimy window. His neck ached from sleeping hunched over, but that discomfort vanished when he saw the journal. The first page, blank when he'd fallen asleep, now contained a poem written in his own careful handwriting. The sparrow builds her nest in October's dying breath, while underneath the cobbler's stone, roots remember death. 3 drops of blood, a silver coin, a whisper in the night. Tomorrow brings the weeping rain and Mrs. Chen's last light. Lawrence stared at the words. He had no memory of writing them, yet the handwriting was unmistakably his, down to the particular way he crossed his T's and the slight leftward slant of his letters. The poem itself was unlike anything he'd written before. His usual work was abstract, philosophical. This was concrete, specific, almost journalistic in its precision. Mrs. Chen was his elderly neighbour, a Chinese woman who kept to herself except for nodding politely when they passed on the stairs. She had seemed perfectly healthy the last time he'd seen her. That afternoon, rain began to fall in heavy sheets. By evening, the building was filled with the sound of weeping from the apartment below. Mrs. Chen had died in her sleep, the landlord explained. Peaceful, like she'd simply decided not to wake up. Lawrence spent the night pacing his room, the journal unopened on his desk. Coincidence, he told himself. London was full of elderly people who died unexpectedly. The rain was hardly unprecedented in November. But when sleep finally took him, he dreamed again of the library. This time, he glimpsed the figure more clearly, tall, wearing a dark coat that seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure's face remained hidden, but its voice whispered through the stacks. The ink knows what the dreamer has forgotten. Morning brought another poem. The banker's wife will wear the blue, the one that brings her shame, and in the market square at noon, a stranger speaks her name. The flower girl will drop her roses, scattered on the stone, while in the shadow of the church, a secret finds its home. Lawrence dressed quickly and made his way to the market square, the journal tucked inside his coat. He told himself he was merely observing, conducting an experiment in probability and chance. At 11:30, a woman in an elegant blue dress approached the flower seller's stall. She moved with the careful precision of someone trying not to attract attention, but the dress was unmistakably expensive, and unmistakably the wrong shade for her complexion, making her appear wan and sickly. A few minutes before noon, a man Lawrence didn't recognize called out, "Mrs. Whitmore, fancy seeing you here." The woman in blue startled so violently that she knocked into the flower girl's display, sending roses scattering across the cobblestones like drops of blood. That night, Lawrence tried to stay awake. He brewed strong tea, splashed cold water on his face, even resorted to pinching himself when his eyelids grew heavy. But exhaustion was a tide that couldn't be held back forever. Sometime before dawn, he succumbed. The dream library seemed more vivid this time. The shelves were closer together, the air thicker with the scent of aging paper. The figure in the dark coat was waiting for him, seated at a reading table made of what looked like compressed books. "You cannot fight the tide of sleep," the figure said without looking up from a volume that seemed to write itself as he read. "The journal chooses its chronicler, not the other way around." "What do you want from me?" Lawrence asked, and this time his voice carried. "Want?" The figure's laugh was like pages turning. "I want nothing. I am merely the librarian. You are the one who wishes to know the future. I never asked for this." "Didn't you?" The figure finally looked up, and where its face should have been was only shadow beneath the brim of a hat. Every poet seeks to capture truth before it dies. I simply show you truth before it lives. Lawrence woke to find a new poem, longer than the others. The green-eyed cat will cross the path of lovers in the lane, and she who swore she'd never love will find her vow in vain. The butcher's boy will lose his job for stealing bread and meat, while in the tavern's darkest corner, enemies will meet. But when the clock strikes midnight's hour and shadows lose their way, remember this, remember well. Elias holds the key. There it was again. Elias. Lawrence had noticed the name appearing in previous poems, always in the final stanza, always as though it were significant. Yet he knew no one by that name, had never met an Elias in his life. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Each night brought dreams of the impossible library. Each morning revealed new verses. Lawrence began keeping detailed notes, documenting the predictions and their fulfillment. The accuracy was uncanny, not just in broad strokes, but in minute details that seemed impossible to guess. He started small, sharing a few poems with other writers at the coffee houses he frequented. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. His work had always been too cerebral, too removed from human experience. These new poems thrummed with life, with concrete imagery and prophetic power that left readers unsettled and enthralled. Within a month, he had attracted the attention of Harold Blackwood, a publisher known for taking risks on unconventional works. Blackwood was a small, intense man who wore round spectacles and had the habit of drumming his fingers while he read. He sat in Lawrence's modest room, the growing collection of poems spread across the narrow table. "Extraordinary," he murmured, adjusting his spectacles. "It's as though you're documenting the city's secret life. How do you do it?" Lawrence had prepared for this question. "I observe, I listen, I piece together patterns that others miss. And this recurring figure, Elias, a lover, a rival, the poems suggest an intimacy, a personal connection. A composite character, a representation of fate, perhaps, or coincidence." Blackwood's eyes sharpened. "You don't sound certain." "Poetry is rarely about certainty, Mr. Blackwood." The publisher gathered the pages carefully. "I'd like to publish these. A collection. We'll call it Night Inks. The poems have a quality, as though they were written in darkness and secrecy. People will want to read them." The contract was modest but fair. More importantly, it represented validation, proof that his work had value. As Blackwood prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Might I ask, do you write these at night? There's something about them that feels nocturnal." "I suppose I do my best work in the small hours," Lawrence replied, which was true enough. Night Inks was published in a small edition that winter. The response was immediate and polarizing. Critics called the work either brilliantly prophetic or morbidly sensationalistic. Readers, however, devoured it. The poem's uncanny accuracy in predicting local events became a topic of fascination and debate. Some claimed Lawrence had inside information from police or government sources. Others suggested he was remarkably skilled at reading social and economic patterns. The truth, of course, was far stranger. Success brought unexpected complications. Lawrence found himself invited to literary salons and poetry readings, events where he was expected to discuss his methods and inspiration. He developed a repertoire of vague, mystical-sounding explanations that seemed to satisfy most questioners. But increasingly, he noticed gaps in his memory. Small things at first. He would arrive at a dinner party with no clear recollection of accepting the invitation. He would find letters in his apartment addressed to him by name, but couldn't remember the people who had written them. Shopkeepers greeted him as Mr. Marrow, when he was certain he'd never visited their establishments before. The journal grew heavier. Some mornings he would find multiple poems, pages and pages of verses that seemed to have been written in a fever of inspiration. The handwriting remained his own, but the style was evolving, becoming more elaborate, more archaic. The predictions grew darker as well. One poem described a fire that would consume a workhouse in Whitechapel. 3 days later, 17 people died in exactly such a blaze. Another foretold the suicide of a prominent banker, down to the method and location. Lawrence began to feel like he was chronicling a city's nightmares rather than its daily life. The dreams intensified as well. The library seemed to expand each night, its shelves stretching into impossible distances. The figure in the dark coat, who never gave his name but whom Lawrence had begun thinking of as the librarian, became more talkative, more present. "You are becoming quite accomplished," the librarian observed one night, gesturing to the endless rows of books. "Your chronicles are adding substance to the collection." "Chronicles?" "Every poem you write joins the library. Every prediction fulfilled becomes part of the permanent record. You are helping to write the city's true history, not the sanitized version that appears in newspapers, but the secret narratives that connect all things." Lawrence wandered the aisles, noting that many of the books now bore his name on their spines, volumes titled The Whitechapel Prophecies and Marrow's Midnight Observations, sat alongside works by authors he'd never heard of. All the books seemed to glow faintly, as though lit from within. "Who was here before me?" he asked. "Many have served as chroniclers. Few have shown your dedication. Most fight the calling. They try to return to their small, predictable lives. But you embrace the gift." "Is it a gift? Sometimes it feels like a curse." The librarian's laugh was soft, almost gentle. "All gifts are curses to those who don't understand their purpose. You are recording what others cannot see. You are preserving truths that would otherwise be lost." Lawrence picked up one of the books bearing his name. When he opened it, he found his own poems, but also annotations in a different hand, observations about their accuracy, their literary merit, their contribution to the Chronicle. The handwriting in the margins was elegant, old-fashioned, and signed with a simple E. "Who is Elias?" he asked suddenly. The librarian was quiet for a long moment. "Elias is the name of the one who remembers. When the chroniclers are forgotten, when their words fade from the world above, Elias ensures they remain part of the permanent record." Lawrence's waking life continued to deteriorate. He would lose hours at a time, coming to consciousness in unfamiliar parts of London, with no memory of how he'd arrived there. His reflection in mirrors seemed to waver, becoming indistinct, as though he were slowly fading from the physical world. He found verses hidden throughout his apartment, tucked between the pages of other books, folded inside the pockets of coats he didn't remember buying, even carved into the wooden floor beneath his bed. All were in his handwriting, but some were in scripts he didn't recognize. Gothic lettering, elaborate calligraphy, ancient-looking alphabets that hurt his eyes to look at directly. The poems themselves grew increasingly complex. What had begun as simple predictions of daily events evolved into elaborate prophetic works that seemed to span decades or even centuries. He wrote of wars that hadn't happened, of inventions that didn't exist, of social changes that seemed impossibly distant. Yet when he showed these to Blackwood, the publisher was thrilled. "You're developing an extraordinary voice," Blackwood said during one of their meetings. "These newer works have a scope, a grandeur that lifts them beyond mere prediction into the realm of true prophecy. I'm planning a second volume." But Lawrence was becoming frightened. He tried staying awake for 3 consecutive nights, dosing himself with coffee and laudanum in alternating cycles. By the end of the 3rd day, he was hallucinating, seeing the librarian in crowds on the street, finding books from the dream library shelved in real bookshops, hearing whispers of poetry in languages he didn't recognize. When he finally collapsed into sleep, the dream was different. Instead of the familiar library, he found himself in what looked like a scriptorium from centuries past. Dozens of figures sat at high desks, all writing by candlelight, all wearing the same dark coats as the librarian. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but he could hear the scratch of their pens, the whisper of pages turning. "Welcome to the true Chronicle," said a familiar voice. The librarian stood beside him, but now Lawrence could see that he was not alone. Other figures in dark coats moved between the desks, examining the work, making notes in the margins. "What is this place?" "This is where the real work is done. The dreams you've been having, the poems you write, they're just the beginning, the surface level. Here is where the deep patterns are recorded, where the true connections between all things are preserved." Lawrence approached one of the desks. The writer there, he couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, was copying out text from a book that appeared to be writing itself. The words were in English, but they described events from what seemed to be the distant future. Wars fought with weapons he couldn't understand, cities that didn't exist, names of people who hadn't been born. "How long have you been doing this?" he whispered. "Time moves differently here. Some of our chroniclers have been at work for centuries, others for mere decades. A few, like yourself, are just beginning their true service." "I don't want this. I want my life back." "Your life?" The librarian gestured to the working figures. "Look more closely." Lawrence did, and with growing horror, he began to recognize some of the writers. There was Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had lived in his building until she'd mysteriously disappeared the previous month. At another desk sat Samuel Holt, a minor poet who had been quite popular a few years ago, before vanishing from literary circles entirely. And there, at a desk near the far wall, was a figure whose face he couldn't see but whose posture, whose way of holding a pen, was achingly familiar. "That's impossible," he breathed. "Is it? You've been preparing for this transition for months. Your memory of the waking world grows dim. Your physical presence becomes less substantial. Soon you'll make the final crossing, and your work here can begin in earnest." Lawrence tried to run, but his feet wouldn't obey him. The dream held him fast as the librarian continued speaking. "Don't be afraid. The chroniclers are honored here. Your work will outlast empires. Your words will be read when the last star burns cold. Isn't that what every poet dreams of? True immortality?" Lawrence woke in his own bed, but the room felt different, smaller, more distant, as though he were viewing it through thick glass. The journal lay open beside him, and he could see that new poems had appeared. But now the handwriting was changing mid-verse, transforming from his familiar script into something more elaborate, more archaic. The latest poem was the longest yet. In chambers deep where candles burn with light that casts no glow, The chroniclers set down in ink what mortals cannot know. They write of futures yet to pass, of pasts that never were, while shadows dance round their quills and time becomes a blur. The city sleeps above their heads, unknowing of the cost, of every word they've ever read from authors who are lost. For when a writer disappears, when fame becomes a lie, their truest work begins below where dreams and visions die. So take this warning, gentle reader, if these words you chance to see. Some stories are not meant for those who still believe they're free. The journal calls to troubled souls who seek to know what's true, but knowledge has a price to pay, and it may yet claim you. For in the end, when morning comes and memory grows dim, the chronicler must make a choice, the world above or him. And those who choose the deeper truth, who dare to cross the line, will find their names in other books but never more in mine. Remember this when shadows fall and sleep begins to call. The greatest stories ever told were written by none at all. And in the space between the worlds where truth and fiction meet, Elias waits with patient smile to make the tale complete. As he finished reading, Lawrence noticed something that made his blood run cold. His signature at the bottom of the poem, the L. Marrow he'd been signing his name with since childhood, was different. The letters were fading, becoming indistinct. And beneath them, in clearer, more confident script, appeared another signature. E. Nocturne. He looked at his hands. They seemed translucent in the weak morning light, as though he were slowly becoming a ghost. When he tried to speak his own name aloud, the sound came out distorted, wrong. The journal's pages began to turn by themselves, faster and faster, until they reached the very back. There, on the inside cover, was a list of names written in different hands. All were crossed out except for two: Lawrence Marrow, final draft pending; E. Nocturne, Chronicle, complete. As he watched, a line slowly drew itself through his name. That night, Lawrence didn't fight the sleep. He knew with the certainty that comes in dreams that this would be his last night in the waking world. The journal felt warm in his hands as he settled into his chair, as though it were alive and content. The library that awaited him was vast beyond imagination. The librarian was there, of course, but now Lawrence could see his face clearly. It was kind, patient, with eyes that held the depth of centuries. He wore a small smile as he gestured to an empty desk positioned near a great window that looked out not onto London streets, but onto a cosmos of swirling words and half-formed stories. "Welcome, Elias," he said. "Your true work begins now." Lawrence, no, Elias, took his place at the desk. The tools were already waiting, pens that wrote with liquid starlight, ink that shifted colour based on the truth of what was written, paper that sang softly when words appeared upon it. Around him, the other chroniclers worked in comfortable silence, their pens scratching out the secret histories of worlds both real and imagined. He picked up his pen and began to write. The words came easily now, flowing like water, like music, like the fundamental rhythms of existence itself. He wrote of London, not the London of gas lamps and cobblestones, but the London of dreams and shadows, of stories that lived in the spaces between heartbeats. He wrote of the poets and dreamers who would come after him, who would find the journal in bookstalls and pawnshops, who would be drawn by its blank pages and the promise of inspiration. He wrote their stories before they lived them, chronicled their transformations before they understood what was happening to them. And always, at the end of each new piece, he signed the same name, Elias. Time passed. Hours or centuries, It was impossible to tell. Occasionally, other chroniclers would pause in their work to read over his shoulder, nodding approvingly at a particularly elegant turn of phrase or a especially prophetic passage. The librarian moved among them all like a benevolent supervisor, offering encouragement and guidance. "The mortal world will forget Lawrence Marrow," Elias said during one of these visits. "Yes," the librarian agreed. "But they will remember the stories. They will remember the predictions that came true, the poems that captured truth before it was born, and new chroniclers will always be needed." And the journal returns to the world, seeking its next author. The cycle continues. It must continue. In a crowded market in Soho, on a day when the fog hung particularly thick, a young woman named Sarah Mills paused before a bookstall she'd never noticed before. The vendor was an elderly man with kind eyes who seemed to look right through her when he spoke. "Looking for something specific, are we?" he asked in an accent she couldn't quite place. Sarah was a writer, or trying to be one. Her notebooks were filled with half-finished stories, her apartment littered with rejection letters. She'd been walking for hours, hoping the movement would shake loose some inspiration. Among the books on display, one caught her attention. A small journal bound in burgundy leather, its cover decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. When she opened it, every page was blank. "This one," she said without thinking. "Ah, yes. That belonged to a chronicler who completed his work, a man who wrote the stories between stories, who captured the dreams that others forgot upon waking." Sarah ran her fingers over the smooth paper. It felt warm, welcoming, full of potential. "How much?" £3. It was more than she could afford, but something about the journal called to her. As she counted out her coins, the vendor tilted his head. "A word of advice, young chronicler. Some gifts come with invisible strings, but perhaps you're ready to be caught." When Sarah looked up from her purse, the stool was gone. She stood alone in the fog, the journal heavy in her hands, while around her the market continued as though nothing had changed. That night, she sat at her desk with the journal open before her, trying to write. But her pen seemed reluctant to mark the strange paper, and eventually exhaustion overcame her ambition. She fell asleep at her desk, her head pillowed on her arms. In her dreams, she walked through a vast library where the air tasted of midnight and old paper. A figure in a dark coat moved between the shelves, always just beyond clear sight, leaving only the whisper of footsteps and a faint scent of ink. When she woke the next morning, the first page of the journal was no longer blank. In her own handwriting, she found a poem she didn't remember writing. "The rain will fall on Grafton Street at 3:30 today, and she who swore she'd leave this place will find a reason to stay. The baker's son will lose his ring, the one his mother gave, while in the shadow of the church, new stories find their grave. But when the evening light grows dim and shadows start to dance, remember this, remember well, the chroniclers advance. For every word that finds its way from dream to waking page is guided by a gentle hand across the bridge of age. And in the space between the worlds where truth and fiction meet, Elias writes with patient smile to make each tale complete." Sarah stared at the poem, her heart racing. She had no memory of writing it, yet the handwriting was unmistakably hers. The name at the end, Elias, meant nothing to her, yet something about it felt significant, important. Outside her window, the first drops of rain began to fall. In the great chronicle that exists between sleeping and waking, between memory and forgetting, The stories continue. The journal passes from hand to hand, seeking those souls brave enough or desperate enough to peer behind the veil of ordinary existence. And in the scriptorium of dreams, Elias writes on, chronicling the secret histories of all who dare to dream, preserving the stories that might otherwise be lost in the space between one heartbeat and the next. For every ending is also a beginning, and every chronicler who completes their work becomes part of the eternal library, adding their voice to the chorus of those who write the world's hidden truths. The fog rolls on, and the journal waits, patient as time itself, ready for the next soul who needs to discover that some stories are worth forgetting yourself to tell.